Methodology of Humanities, Module 3, Narration and Representation. The teller, reader, and structure of narratives. In the last class, we had talked about one constituent element of narratives, which is text and textuality. In this session, we would be talking about the other two constituent elements of narrative, which is the teller and the reader. Also, we would be talking about the structure of narrative as discussed by various writers. The one who tells is another important aspect of narrative or narratives. The story has to be told. Narration can either be very obvious, overt narration, or it could be something which is difficult to detect. You have covert narration. A narrator takes the viewpoint of the character or may present the view of several characters or approach a story from a godlike viewpoint. Now we know what the first person, second person and third person narratives are. First person narratives are narratives where the narrator is the main character and it is largely talking about the self. The pronouns which are used by the first person narrative is I, me, my, we, us. An example would be I was happy. Second person narrative where the speaker speaks to the reader. For instance, you were happy, and the pronouns used in the second person narratives are you, your, etc. Third person narratives where the narrator tells about another person or other people. An instance would be he was happy. Coming to the term author. Author was coined from the Latin term auctor, A-U-C-T-O-R, which was extended to cover the creatorship of factual and fictional texts. It was only from the 15th century that scholars and poets were referred to as auctors. Narrator, you come to the narrator of a text, is not the same as the author of a text. The narrator of a text is not the same as the author of the text. It is the author who creates the narrator of the text. In page 114 of the text is given a diagram based on Seymour Chapman regarding the relationship between the teller and the reader. In the making of the meaning of a text, there is an active involvement of an implied author a narrator, the narratee, and implied reader. So all these positions or all these readers and narrators are actively involved in making the meaning of a text. You have a narrator, you have an implied author, you have a narratee, and you have an implied reader. Now, what is or who is an implied author? Who is a narrator? Who is a narratee, and who is an implied reader? Implied author. An implied author is not the real author, but the author that the reader constructs from the text. Narrator does not always reflect the values of the implied author. The implied author does not speak or does not deliver direct messages to the reader. Now, coming to the reader of a text, you have a narratee and you have an implied reader. Implied reader is not the real reader, but just like the implied author, an implied reader is a reader who is presupposed by the text. Wolfgang Iser says that the hypothetical reader or implied reader is a hypothetical reader that a work is addressed to, whose thoughts, attitudes differ from an actual reader. The actual reader is one who picks up a book, buys a book, picks up a book and reads it. Coming to a narratee. Narratee is the counterpart of the narrator, one who is addressed by the narrator. A narratee is inscribed in the narrative text and must be distinguished from the implied reader. So these four constituent parts, you have a narrator, an implied author, a narratee, an implied reader. All these reader and narrator positions are actively involved in creating the meaning of a text. Now you have three forms of authorship that are discussed, narratorship that is discussed in the text. Heterodiegetic narrator, homodiegetic narrator, and autodiegetic narrator. What is heterodiegetic narrator? A narrator who is outside the story, an omniscient presence outside the story, who views things, all the things that happen in the text without interfering. A heterodiegetic narrator is not a character in the story. Sometimes such a narrator can narrate a story about other character from the inside of the story. In such instances, the narrator is called a heterodiegetic, intradiegetic narrator. Coming to the second type of narrator, homodiegetic narrator, is a narrator who is also a character in the story. Unlike a heterodiegetic narrator, who is not a character, a homodiegetic narrator is also a character in the story. The story is narrated by a homodiegetic, this narrator, who is a first person narrator. Coming to autodiegetic narrator, if the homodiegetic narrator is also the protagonist of the narrative, that is, The narrator, who is also a character in the story, is also the protagonist of the narrative, who is telling his or her own story. Then such a narrator is called an autodiegetic narrator. Autodiegetic narratives are largely seen in autobiographies. These are the three important kinds of narrators in a text. Now, moving on to the next category is the reader of a narrative. As we have already said, there is a narratee, a reader, and an implied reader in a text. The text constructs an addressee to whom the story is told, who is called the narratee. So the narratee is an addressee, okay, who the text constructs and to whom the story is told. The addressee of the narrator, the fictive entity. So the narratee is the addressee of the narrator, the fictive entity to whom the narrator directs his or her narration. Implied reader, on the other hand, is the reader who is presupposed by the text. Okay, Wolfgang Iser states that, or describes that, an implied reader is a hypothetical figure who is likely to get most of what the author intended. When an author writes a book, they have a certain reader in mind, one who is familiar to what the author has written earlier, one who understands, makes connection. So such a reader position is called an implied reader. Implied reader refers to the active nature of the process of reading, which, the meaning which will vary historically from one age to another. Beginning in the mid-1960s, the relationship between the text, author and reader has been rewritten, understood in a different manner. We have already seen this in the last session. Reader response critics invited the reader to actively engage in the process of generating meaning. According to the reader response critics, reader response again, it recognizes the reader as an active agent in understanding a text, unlike the new critical way of reading. So the reader response critics insist that readers cannot be ignored. Iser has talked about how reading a text might impact on the text's reader. A text has no verifiable true meaning which is hidden inside figurative language. Rather, it is generated through the active interaction of the reader and the text. So these are the three constituent elements of a narrative: the text, the teller, and the reader. Now we move on to the different structures of a narrative. We already told about how there are three ways in which narratives are understood. You have a literary narrative, historical narrative, and philosophical narrative. Now we'll be talking about literary narratives largely. Fabula, okay, is a term that we need to remember here. Fabula is the skeleton form of a narrative. It is a series of logically and chronologically related events. If you know the story of Cinderella, for example, the fabula, or the structure of the narrative would be about a girl who went to a ball in the palace, then she leaves her shoe there, then the prince comes in search of the shoe and meets Cinderella and then marries Cinderella. This would be the bare structure of the story, and this is what is called fabula. For example, you have a underlying structure. If you look in cinema, for example, you have a villain who often interferes to abduct a woman or do anything that we consider as bad, so that the male man or the male can establish, the hero can establish his masculinity. So you have an underlying structure where you need a hero, and in order to establish the heroine as the masculinity of the hero, you need a villain who comes and does all those things like abduction, kidnapping, terrorist activities, etc. Now, different from fabula, you have another category called plot or sujet. If fabula is about the framework of a narrative, plot is about the ordering of things into that framework in a way that creates an interesting narrative. Plot is about how the raw materials that make up the chronology are organized in a narrative. The summary of the story in a literary work elucidating events with causes and motivation, organized to create a particular effect. Okay, this is what is called plot. A plot actually enhances the literary effect of a story. Story is the actual sequence of events, while plot is the ordered, packaged and presented way in which the story is told. Okay, so plot is the particular ordering of events through which a narrative can be told. So, for example, flashbacks can be used where you need to go back in time. So all these happen in plot. Plot could begin somewhere in the, unlike a story where you need a chronology to the events that happen. Plot could begin somewhere in the middle of the chain of events, then go back, as flashbacks, return to the present, go to the future, etc. So the text gives in the text you have the example of how a fabula of Cinderella is converted into a plot of Cinderella. Likewise, coming to Vladimir Prop, the Russian formalist, who worked on Russian folk tales. So Prop identifies around 31 recurrent structures in folk tales. He calls these as functions. In his book, The Morphology of the Folk Tale, published in 1928, he discusses how a function was a content element, or function is a content element, which is an action of a character. Okay, the action that fulfills the purpose. So you have some recurring 31 codes or functions in folk tales, which keeps recurring in if you check various folk tales in Russia, you can see this underlying code working in different manners in all these tales. All 31 functions need not occur in the same tale, but it occurs in a certain order. For example, a theft can't happen before the door is forced. So such patterns, certain patterns can be found in the tales of Russia, according to Vladimir Prop. So according to Prop, all fairy tales can be reduced to a set of 7 characters or 7 spheres of action. And it is through the relationship between these aspects that a tale evolves. So you have 7 features, in a folk tale, in a Russian folk tale, which often recurs in the story, in the plot of the Russian tales. You have a hero, then a false hero, a villain, a helper, a donor, a princess and her father, and a dispatcher. So these are the 7 things, that keep coming up in a Russian folk tale. You have a hero, a false hero, a villain, a helper, a donor, a princess and her father, and a dispatcher. Now coming to French structuralism and its version of narratology. A.J. Grimus identifies some 6 elements to a narrative, which he calls actants, just as Prop identifies about 31 functions and 7 characters in Russian folk tales, which he says recurs in all these tales. A.J. Grimus identifies 6 elements, which he calls as actants. These are subject and object, sender and receiver, helper and opponent. So Grimus organized the narrative functions of these actants into 3 types. Okay. The first is desire, search, aim, where the subject has an aim and desire, which in turn directs them to reach the goal. So what he is telling is that there is a structure, there is an underlying structure to all the tales that we hear, and in all these tales the following elements or the following parts appear recurrently. So you can identify a certain recurring pattern in the tales that are tales of a particular region. So the first such a function, that is desire, search and aim, where the subject has an aim and desire, which in turn directs them to reach the goal. Okay. Then communication. An actant is sent out in search of his mission by a sender who rewards the subject upon the success of the mission, and the receiver also compensates the subject. That is, there would be an actant who would be sent out in search of a particular mission in all these tales, and on the success of the particular mission, the person or the receiver compensates the subject who is successful in his mission. Then you have a third function, which is auxiliary support or hindrance. So there would be a helper. So in all these stories there would be a helper who helps the subject, and an opponent, who obstructs the subject in his mission. So these would be patterns that you could find in a text or in a narrative. You have a subject who has an aim and desire, which helps them reach a particular goal. Then you have a sender who is sent on a mission, and an opponent who obstructs the sender through various means. You have a receiver who actually compensates the sender once she is successful in her mission. Then you have auxiliary support to that particular subject. Now we move on to another structure of the narrative as discussed by Roland Barthes. In his structural analysis of narrative, published in 1977, and SZ, published in 1970, Roland Barthes identifies 561 units of meaning, while reading a short story by Balzac, which he named Lexias. So he identifies again 561 units of meaning. There were codes which Barthes organized under 5 main groups. So there are 561 units of meaning which Barthes identifies or organizes under 5 main groups. These 5 units are, or 5 codes are: proeretic code, hermeneutic code, cultural code, semic code, and the symbolic code. Proeretic code refers to the sequence in which events occur. So there is a certain sequence that narratives follow, and proeretic code is about the ordering of a narrative, ordering of a certain happening. Hermeneutic code explains and informs the reader about the details of the narratives. Okay, how a certain narrative happens, what happens. So hermeneutic code explains all these things. You come to the cultural code, which are codes shared in a community and the elements of common knowledge, history, culture which is shared by a group of people. So for example, when you have reference to Theyyam in a particular text, which can be understood by people coming from a certain region, from a certain community. Coming to the semic code, it is an accepted set of stereotypical signs which give information about people in situations without much explanations. So semic code is about certain stereotypical signs, right, which is shown and which needn't have more explanations. Coming to symbolic code, which is similar to semic code, but the meaning extends beyond the immediate stereotype and refers to something larger. Okay. So for example, you have, if you look at films, you often have trains as symbolic of a massive transformation that is happening in the narrative. In films like Patar Panjali, Neelakuil, etc., the arrival of a train refers to a massive transformation that is happening in the narrative. In Patar Panjali, for example, you have the arrival of a train immediately before the death of the daughter Durga. Or you have boiling milk which spills out of the tumbler to suggest something that happens to the heroine of a narrative, etc. So these are symbolic codes. Now coming to another thinker, Gerard Genette, who identifies again between 3 levels of narrative. All narratives, according to Genette, follows these 3 levels of narration: the histoyer, the recit, and narrating. Histoyer is a story or a set of events or actions that happened in the past and which has to be narrated. Recit is also called narrative, which is told in an oral or written form. It represents speech or writing by the author through which the story reaches the reader. Narrating is the larger process of recounting something, telling something in detail. So these are the three levels of narration that Janet identifies.